Today's lecture is on species interactions. Before the lecture begins, make sure that you've read the assigned chapter for this lecture and taken notes on that chapter material. Also, before the lecture begins, make sure you've created an outline for the lecture material as you flipped through the PDF for the lecture prior to even listening. During the lecture, minimize distractions by turning off Netflix, any movies or TV in the background, turning off music, and listening in a quiet space. You also want to go ahead and turn off your phone. You don't want any distractions while you're trying to learn this material. Be sure you take plenty of notes, and again, most studies demonstrate that handwritten notes are the best way to incorporate the information. Put these slides in your own words to maximize your learning. Let's get started. Here's our concept map for the lecture. We're going to look at different types of interactions between species. We're going to look at communities. And finally, we're going to look at disturbances that can impact communities. First, let's orient ourselves along the biological hierarchy. The last lecture focused on population ecology, and today we're thinking 2 scales above the level of the population. We're looking at communities and ecosystems. Remember that this hierarchy was in our lecture on biological themes, so take a moment and pause the lecture, go back to those notes and any in-class activities that might have assisted you with your understanding of biological hierarchies. Understanding this hierarchy is necessary for the rest of this lecture. Ecologists call relationships between species in a community interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions can affect the survival and reproduction of each species within that community and can be summarized by positive, negative, or no effect. Examples of these types of interactions are competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. Some key relationships in the life of an organism are its interactions with individuals of other species within the community. These are your interspecific interactions. These interactions between members of different species can be defined according to whether or not they have a positive or negative effect on survival and reproduction. For example, predation is a plus-minus interaction with a positive effect on survival and reproduction success of the predator and a negative effect on that of the prey. Predation or herbivory and parasitism can all be characterized as exploitation. Note that the 0 in a definition of commensalism means that one partner in the interaction does not pay either a benefit or a cost. Mutualism is a plus-plus interaction. It is an interspecific interaction that benefits both species. In some mutualistic relationships, one or both species cannot survive without the other. Each partner in a mutualistic interaction experiences a cost, but the benefits of the interaction far exceed the cost to the participants. For example, acacia trees and ants are dependent upon each other for survival and reproduction. In other mutualisms, both species can often survive alone. In commensalism, plus-minus interaction, one species benefits and the other is neither harmed nor helped. For example, some wildflowers benefit from the habitat provided by the forest tree, but do not affect the tree in any way. The effect of ecological interactions can change. For example, cattle egrets typically have a commensal relationship with cattle, but occasionally the relationship can also be mutualistic. Next, we're going to look at exploitation, and we're going to consider interactions between species such as predation, herbivory, and parasitism. These are all plus-minus interactions where one species benefits in terms of survival and reproductive success and the other loses. Predation is a situation where one individual kills and eats another individual. Predators have an acute sense for locating prey, such as the heat-sensing organs used by pit vipers. Some predator adaptations for capturing prey include claws, fangs, and poison. Prey also display various defense adaptations. Behavioral defenses include hiding, fleeing, forms of herds or schools, and active self-defense. Animals also have morphological and physiological defense adaptations, including cryptic coloration or camouflage. Camouflage makes prey difficult to spot, and in some cases, a prey species may gain significant protection by mimicking the appearance of another species. In Batesian mimicry, a palatable or harmless species mimics an unpalatable or harmful species. Predators can also use mimicry to attract or sneak up on prey. Another of the exploitation interactions is herbivory, where one individual eats the tissue of another species. But unlike predation, this does not always result in the death of the individual like predation does. Large mammalian herbivores are mostly familiar, but most herbivores are small invertebrates. In marine communities, sea urchins, fish, and some mammals, such as the manatee, are herbivores. Herbivores have adaptations such as chemical sensors and specialized teeth or digestive systems for seeking and feeding on prey. Plants also have defenses, and these include chemical toxins as well as protective structures such as spines and thorns. Our final exploitation relationship that we're going to consider is parasitism. This is a situation where one individual, the parasite, derives nourishment from the individual of another species, the host. Parasites that live within the body of their host are called endoparasites. Parasites that live on the external surface of a host are called ectoparasites. Many parasites have a complex life cycle involving multiple hosts, and some parasites change the behavior of the host in a way that increases the parasite's fitness. Parasites can significantly affect survival, reproduction, and density of host populations, either directly or indirectly. So when we're looking at the exploitation interactions, we've considered predation, herbivory, and parasitism. Another interspecific competition is a minus-minus interaction that occurs when individuals of different species compete for a resource that limits the survival and reproduction of each species. Competition can involve nearby plant species competing for nutrients or water, or two different predator species competing for the same prey species. Strong competition can lead to competitive exclusion, where one of the competing species drives the other to local extinction. The competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot permanently coexist in the same place. Let's review a classic experiment that shows support for competitive exclusion. In 1934, Gauss studied competition in a controlled lab experiment. He was working on two closely related protist species. When he cultured each of these species separately, the cultures did very well and the populations grew rapidly, leveling off at the carrying capacity. However, when he grew them together, the protists competed for the same food source, and one species, the same one, always went extinct. In the example just given, the species were very similar and were competing for the same food in the exact same space, the test tube. In nature, we can often identify slightly different food or habitat preferences between species, even closely related ones. We call this the ecological niche, the specific set of biotic and abiotic resources that an organism uses in its environment. For example, a tropical tree lizard has a niche that can be described by the temperature range it tolerates, the size of branches it prefers to perch on, the time of day when it is active, and the type and sizes of insects that it eats. We can use the concept of the ecological niche to help explain why competitive exclusion does not reduce diverse biological communities to simple systems with just a few superior competitors. Recall that competitive exclusion states that two species cannot coexist indefinitely if their niches are identical. However, if the two species partition the resources, they may coexist. This concept of sharing niche space is called resource partitioning. Competition results in the differentiation of ecological niches, enabling similar species to coexist. The figure on the screen nicely illustrates this point. There are 7 species of Anole lizards that live in close proximity to one another in the Dominican Republic. They all feed on insects and other small arthropods, but they partition the niche by each having a different preferred perch. The location of these preferred perches is indicated by the location of the species' Latin name on the figure. One prefers to perch on or near the ground, while another is in the tree canopy. The actual niche space for each species might have a lot of overlap, but when they are found together, competition shrinks down the niche space, reducing the overlap. Competition can also result in character displacement, which is a tendency for characteristics to be more divergent in sympatric populations of species found in the same place, than in allopatric populations of the same two species, where allopatry refers to the populations found in different places. A great example of character displacement comes from the famous Galapagos finches. In this example of character displacement, there are 2 species of seed-eating ground finches who have very similar ecological niches. These 2 species, Fuliginosa, the smaller species of groundfinch, and Fortis, can be found together on some islands, so in sympatry, in which sym means together. And there are some islands where just one species is found. In this case, the population of the different finch species are considered allopatric. Where the 2 species are sympatric, where they're found together, their beaks diverge in size, which is an evidence for exploiting different seed types when they are directly competing. When they are found in allopatry, when they're not together, we don't see this beak size divergence. If you look at the evidence on the figure of the slide, this walks through this observation. The beak measurements we're considering is beak depth, which is shown on the illustration for Fortis. A larger, deeper beak can enable a bird to crack harder seeds, but may affect handling of smaller seeds. The tree panels below show histograms of beak depth for 3 different island populations of finches. A histogram is a great way to visualize the variation of beak depths per species per island. The y-axis is the proportion of individual birds in each of the beak depth size classes, and beak depth is shown on the x-axis. Notice that all 3 panels have the same axis, so we can visually compare where the distributions fall on the x-axis of beak depth. The orange bars correspond to Fuliginosa, while the green bars represent Fortis. Only Fuliginosa is found on Los Hermanos, and only Fortis is found on Daphne. These populations are allopatric. Notice that there is a lot of overlap in the beak depth between the 2 species in these allopatric populations. They aren't competing with members of the other species on these islands, so we don't see evidence of character displacement. On the other hand, where these 2 species are found together on the same island, so in Sympatry, on Santa Maria and San Cristobal, you can see that the distribution of Fuliginosa beak depths are slightly smaller than on Los Hermanos, and the beak depths of Fortis are larger than those measured on Daphne. So these data demonstrate that there is little to no overlap of the beak depths when the two populations are sympatric. This is an example of character displacement. So we've outlined and defined the various types of interspecific interactions. Now let's look at how biological communities are characterized. Understanding the species interactions within communities is important for describing the community, but it is not the only way to characterize the community. Community ecologists also use measures of biological or species diversity and feeding relationships to describe communities. Species diversity is the variety of different kinds of organisms that make up the community, and it is typically broken down into two components: species richness and relative abundance. Species richness is the number of different species in a community. Relative abundance is the proportion each species represents of all individuals in the community. This distinction and how these two components of diversity together define biological diversity is best shown in a diagram. When you look at these two forest plots, which one do you think is more diverse? If you said community 1, you're correct. Both communities have 4 tree species, A, B, C, and D. So in this example, both communities have the same species richness of 4. However, the number of individuals of each species is far more even in community 1 than in community 2. This relates to relative abundance. The relative abundances are the same for each species in community 1. Each species makes up approximately 25% of the total number of individuals, while in community 2 there is a dominant species, species A, which makes up 80% of the individuals, with only one individual of each of the other species. It can be more challenging to determine which community is more diverse when both of these complementary components of diversity differ, especially if they differ in opposing ways. There are algorithms that help ecologists sort out these more complicated situations. So as we look at communities and we think about species richness and relative abundance, there are certain species that have very large impacts on community structure. Such species are highly abundant, or they can play a very pivotal role in community dynamics. Dominant species are those that are most abundant or have the highest biomass. One hypothesis suggests that dominant species are most competitive in exploiting resources. Another hypothesis is that they are more successful at avoiding predators and disease. Keystone species exert strong control on a community by their ecological roles or niches. In contrast to a dominant species, a keystone species is not necessarily abundant within a community. As we think about species richness, it is greatest in the tropics, and it generally declines towards the poles. Both latitude and area are two key factors that affect a community's species diversity. Tropical communities are older and have had more time to accumulate new species through speciation. Temperature and polar communities have had to start over repeatedly after major disturbances such as glaciation. Climate is another key factor affecting latitudinal gradients in biodiversity. The two main climatic factors that are correlated with diversity are sunlight and precipitation. The species area curve quantifies the idea that, all other factors being equal, a large geographic area has more species. Islands are an ideal situation for studying biogeographic factors affecting diversity. Species richness on islands depends on the rate of immigration and extinction. So these rates depend on island size. Smaller islands have lower immigration and higher extinction rates. They are also affected by distance from the mainland. Closer islands receive more immigrants and have less extinction. The island equilibrium model predicts species richness will reach a dynamic equilibrium where immigration is balanced by extinction. The number of species at the equilibrium point is a function of the island's size and distance from the mainland. Studies of species richness on the Galapagos Islands support the prediction that species richness increases with island size. The structure and dynamics of a community also depend on the trophic structure, or the feeding relationship between the organisms in the community. You may have heard the term food chain before, and this refers to the transfer of energy between trophic levels, and a food chain is shown on the right-hand side of this slide. At the bottom, we have plants, which are the primary producers. The primary consumer, shown here as a grasshopper, gets energy from eating the primary producers. Carnivores are considered secondary consumers, shown here by a small mammal that eats the grasshopper. Some carnivores are tertiary consumers because they eat the secondary consumers. Finally, this food chain contains a quaternary consumer, a raptor, that eats the snake, that eats the small mammal, that eats the grasshopper, that eats the plant. Food chains are quite simple and may not capture reality all that well. Therefore, scientists often show energy transfer among communities in a web form instead. Here's a food web for an Antarctic marine community. The arrows follow the transfer of food from the producers, in this food web the phytoplankton, through the trophic levels. Food webs tend to be more realistic because they include a larger number of community members compared to most food chains. You can think of food webs as a lot of connected food chains. The relationship between the different organisms in the food web and the size of their population can have a profound effect on the community. Finally, we're going to talk about disturbances that can impact a community. A disturbance is an event that changes a community by removing organisms or altering resource availability. The non-equilibrium model describes communities as constantly changing after disturbances. Most ecologists favor the view that communities are in a state of equilibrium. The balanced nature view focused on interspecific competition as a key factor for determining community composition and stability. Some ecologists argued that disturbances could keep many communities from ever reaching equilibrium. A high level of disturbances is often the result of high intensity and high frequency of disturbances. Low disturbance levels can result from either low intensity or low frequency of disturbances. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that moderate levels of disturbance can foster greater diversity than either high or low levels of disturbance. Storms, fires, floods, and drought are important sources of disturbances. High levels of disturbance exclude many slow-growing or slow-colonizing species, while low levels of disturbance allows dominant species to exclude less competitive species. Intermediate levels of disturbance open habitats up for potential community members without severely altering conditions. For example, invertebrate diversity is highest in New Zealand stream beds when flooding frequency or intensity is intermediate. Small and large-scale disturbances are a natural part of many communities. Human activities represent the strongest disturbances to ecosystems worldwide. Human disturbances to communities usually reduce species diversity. Examples of human disturbances include agricultural development, clear-cutting, overgrazing, and ocean trawling. Ecological communities are universally affected by pathogens, which are disease-causing microorganisms and viruses. These pathogens can have dramatic effects on community structure, especially when they're introduced into new habitats. For example, coral reef communities are being decimated by white band disease, and sudden oak death has killed millions of oaks that support many bird species. Zoonotic pathogens are pathogens that have been transferred from other animals into humans. The transfer of pathogens can be direct, or it can be through an intermediate species called a vector. Many of today's emerging human diseases are zoonotic. Identifying the community of hosts and vectors for pathogens can help prevent disease. For example, recent studies identified 2 species of shrew as the primary hosts for the pathogen of Lyme disease. Ecologists can use knowledge of community interactions to study the spread of zoonotic diseases. Ecologists are also tracking the spread of avian flu in human and domestic and wild bird host populations. Human activities are transporting pathogens around the world at unprecedented rates, and community ecology is necessary to help study and combat these pathogens. So in this lecture, we've covered interspecific interactions, communities, as well as community disturbances. Now it's time to take the notes that you've made during this lecture presentation and combine them with the notes that you took when you read through the assigned chapter. After you've combined those notes, use the ARQ, the questions at the end of the chapter, and the questions at each chapter section to quiz yourself and prepare yourself for the quiz and the test on this material. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your learning assistant that's assigned to this course. Additionally, you can reach out to your professor through office hours, through email, or you can bring your questions to class.